My trusty iPhone says it's 6 o'clock, so let us call this meeting to order and get on with business. I want to remind everybody that we are being televised, and so if we have too many mics, speak into your mic, please, and if we don't want to have too many on because it causes feedback, right? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, citizen comments. Comments will be heard from the audience on any topic not listed on the agenda, not to exceed 3 minutes in length. Do we have anyone here that wants to speak on anything? Seeing none, we will move on to item 3. Which is a workshop session with a presentation on the new subdivision ordinance, Phase 2. Mr. Gaddis.
Well, I'm glad to be here this month. I'm sorry I didn't make it last month. I was double booked, but I understand that Wesley and Jennifer took care of the presentation, so you're kind of up to speed on where we're at, the subdivision ordinance, and we'll keep moving ahead. A couple of other items. The intent was always that we would get the text ready and have it to you in time for your meetings, but I had an additional stipulation that it had to be cleared by the city attorney before I could release it. I sent part 1 to the attorney in early October, and I still haven't received part 1 back. Now on part 2 that I'm going to talk about tonight, we still haven't quite finished the text. Wesley and I are still arguing about some details and how wide curbs and stuff ought to be, but I hope to get that done to get to the attorney hopefully by next week or so, but then we'll keep moving. But so I wanted though to present tonight what's in part 2 to just get you to have a feel for where we're heading and the kinds of things that we're talking about doing, because it's a little bit different take than what you've been doing in the past. But I think we've explained before, I think we're trying to not do what we've done in the past, because what we're doing in the past is creating sprawl, and that's not what makes Bastrop unique or livable. So jumping right in, I mentioned again, we had the first work session in October. This is the one in November. I did say the text for the Part 1 release is pending city attorney. I asked about it again last night. He assured me it was in his briefcase, but he didn't say when he was going to get it back to me. As you recall, we divided the ordinance into thirds. The first third was process and policies, and that's what you all talked about last month. The second third includes things like tree preservation, park dedication, street design, lots and blocks. Actually, the park dedication got included in the first third, but we'll talk about those other items tonight. And then the last third will be drainage, water, sewer, electrical, street lights, and utilities, and street trees. And remember, the part of what we're doing here is subdivisions, as you recall, is a ministerial act. And so if an applicant comes forward with a project that meets all your requirements, then you've got to approve it. What we want to make sure is that your ordinance has everything in it that you want in a subdivision, so they have to meet it in order to get approved. If you leave it too vague, then they could just come up with something vague, and you don't have a choice. There's not a lot of discretion in plat approval. Again, outlined the schedule. We had a work session in October. I gave a presentation to City Council on the 4th of this month. Well, that should be the 14th, I think. Tonight is the part 2 with you all, and then I'll give the council their work session on the 12th of December. Make note of some dates. We have a special meeting on January 4th, at which time you will see part 3, and plus we will go back over the entire ordinance. So that'll be your time to look at the entire ordinance, and that'll be the only thing on the agenda, is to go through it section by section, make sure that you're happy with what's in there. Then we'll have I'll have a work session with the council on the 9th, and then you'll have your regular meeting on the 25th of January, and it'll go to City Council in February. That's the plan. Now, needless to say, we're getting into the time of season when holidays and stuff get in the way, but I'm working my best to make sure that we kind of keep to that schedule. Also, while I'm doing that, Also remind
And
you,
before you get on
Sure.
that, I would just like to say that the way I process things is to have something in front of me. I will hear what you're saying and I will make notes. But before we make our comments on the draft, I would really hope that we would have something in writing before the next meeting.
my hope is that you'll have all 75 pages of the ordinance in front of you prior to your meeting on the 4th. That's the plan. Assuming the attorney and the city manager tell me otherwise.
Oh, maybe you can encourage them also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But it was the city manager that encouraged me to have this tight schedule too. So, you actually have 3 meetings in January. You have your special meeting on the 4th. On the 16th is your joint meeting with the city council. As you may have heard, the city council is meeting with all the boards and commissions to kind of make sure that your interests are aligned and everybody understands where everybody's coming from. So that meeting will occur on the 16th, and then you have your regular meeting on the 25th. But moving right ahead. So the major changes that'll be in part 2 of the subdivision ordinance will be just a new approach to how we'll require developers to lay out subdivisions. We'll have tree preservation requirements. I know that there was an attempt to do that some time ago, that it got caught up in some other issues. We'll take another run at it, and we'll talk about what it will require and what it won't require. It's not going to keep an individual homeowner from taking down a tree on their property. It's more geared toward developers who go in with bulldozers to clear cut their lot. We'll have revised standards for easements. We'll have new street standards, new requirements for laying out lots and blocks, and then standards for survey monuments and property corners. Subdivision ordinances by definition end up to be very engineering oriented. There's lots of details in there, how wide things are, what kinds of concrete you use, but that's part of the requirement to make sure that we have everything we need in there. So one of the main things that we're doing differently is we have a new approach to how we're requiring subdivisions to be designed. We're basically identifying 2 types of subdivisions. One are city subdivisions and one are rural subdivisions. The city subdivisions would be the standards that would apply within our city limits. The rural subdivisions would apply in the ETJ. And as you know, we have 3 or 4 different flavors of ETJ, and then we would apply those as they go out. City standards, streets would be classified by movement with slower design speeds, particularly for local streets and collector streets. And I put the graphic up there because that talks about the survivability of a pedestrian if hit by a vehicle. And at 20 miles per hour, 90% of the time, the pedestrian is uninjured. But by the time you get up to only 40 miles an hour, it is a deadly accident. So keeping speeds below 30, closer to 20 is safer for pedestrians. We're trying to make our city more walkable and more pedestrian friendly. We are not requiring a rectangular grid, but we are encouraging it. There's nothing wrong with having curvilinear streets when it makes sense with the topography, but what we're trying to do is to limit the number of cul-de-sacs and dead-end streets and stuff like that. There needs to be connectivity of the streets. There need to be small walkable blocks throughout the city. We'll require,
Just out of curiosity, how do you encourage a grid system over just the cul-de-sacs and the curves, which end up with higher density for developers?
Well, the main thing that we're doing on the block size is we're going to have a maximum block perimeter. Some cities use maximum block lengths. Some cities use a street connectivity index. It's just as easy just to say your block cannot exceed 1,600 feet perimeter. And that and the purpose is to get streets to connect to each other. Now, we're not prohibiting cul-de-sacs, but we're greatly reducing the lengths of cul-de-sacs and the number of houses that can be on cul-de-sacs. We don't want to have long, and I've got some slides later that talk about, one of the Gaddis laws of planning is that Americans find a good idea and then exaggerate it to where it's no longer a good idea. And cul-de-sacs is one of those. When cul-de-sacs were first introduced in this country, they were very short, and there was a pedestrian path to a park that went along the back of the cul-de-sacs. Now you have cul-de-sacs, a mile or 2 miles long and no way to get in and out once you get there. And so we're trying to minimize that. There's a lot of interest in people living on cul-de-sacs, but you can accomplish the same purpose by having short cul-de-sacs. In fact, a lot of newer developments, instead of having the street as part of the cul-de-sac, they have a pedestrian corridor in there. So it's not a street that you live across. You actually live across from your neighbors with a little green or something like that in there. In Europe, they're called Wunderfs, but we can show you some pictures of that. Like I said, cul-de-sacs are generally prohibited. They are allowed, but they're very short. Alleys.
Sorry.
Sure.
So when you talk about block perimeter being shortened, so up one side of the cul-de-sac, curving around and coming back down is all the same perimeter length? Is that how you?
But see, with a cul-de-sac, you'd have to go all the way around.
Right. Okay.
And so that's why cul-de-sacs don't make sense anymore, because they add perimeter without adding any connectivity.
I got you. Okay.
We also don't want to have long blocks that are unbroken. We do have a provision that you can have a long block as long as you break it up with a pedestrian access across, so that pedestrians don't have to walk around. There's a way to cut through. And in fact, I've got some pictures of that. I know that most cities for the last 30 years have gotten away from alleys, but I think we are asking that we go back to an alley format, and the primary reason is to have rear access for vehicles. And I'll show you a picture of the snout house. You all know what snout houses are? Snout houses are where the lot is so narrow that all you see as you drive down the street is the garage doors, the snout of the house. And that's not how we create neighborhoods. We create neighborhoods by bringing the front door to the street and having the parking toward the rear. And so we need to have a way to get vehicle access to the back. And again, the maximum block perimeters, unless broken up by an interconnecting sidewalk or a civic space lot. You might have a little pocket park, a residential lot that would break up the block. So just some examples of some city style subdivisions, and so you can see blocks are relatively small, a series of alleys that go through. Alleys need to be designed so there's not a lot of direct cut-through traffic. You don't want vehicles using them all the time. You want those for local traffic only or service vehicles. Some other examples from different parts of the country. This is a sample of a pedestrian-oriented cul-de-sac where actually the houses are facing onto a green. And this is actually from the Miller development in Austin. So it is being used, not real common in Texas yet, but it's getting there. This is one of those cut-through walkways between a block. A bunch of nerdy planners walking through there on a tour. That's a city style, and if you want a model for a city style subdivision, go look at Old Town Bastrop. That grid system, except for the alleys, it pretty well meets a lot of the standards that we're basically going to be talking about. When you get out in the rural area in the ETJ, we're a different approach. State law is a little funny because we can extend our subdivision rules to the ETJ, but we can't extend our zoning. So we're limited somewhat on, we can't regulate uses, and density is a little difficult to regulate, but there is a way to do that through impervious cover. So we're going to fall back on the requirements for septic tanks of having at least a 1 acre size lot, so you can get a septic tank and a water well on the same lot and have state mandated separations, but also a maximum impervious level to protect water quality. And there's some cities, Dripping Springs as an example, where they've used that approach to kind of minimize that development. Now, that doesn't mean that that has to occur on every lot, and I'll show you the approach that will allow you to cluster homes, but able to preserve large areas of open space. When we think rural, you don't think of driving down a street and seeing a house every 50 feet. That's not rural. What rural is driving down the road and seeing an open field, and there may be houses tucked back in the trees or in a little cluster, a little village, but you're not seeing house after house after house, and that's what we're trying to get at. So we go through a 5-step design process. You evaluate the existing conditions and then calculate the lot yield that you could get at a density of 1 house per acre. So that's kind of your baseline of how many houses that you can get. Then we look at what are primary and secondary conservation areas. So don't want to build in floodplain. There might be wooded areas. There might be steep slopes. Things that you just look at the property and say that would be a good thing to protect from a rural standpoint. The inverse of that, what's left is the development sites. And so you look at the development sites and decide where's the best place to put houses. And then you align the streets to connect to the houses, and then you draw in the lot lines. So it's kind of backwards of the way most developers work. The developers look at a piece of paper and say, well, how many lots can I get on this piece of property? And it doesn't matter, and I'll show you some examples of the standard process of trying to maximize the number of lots. What we're saying is use the lots at one house per acre and then let you kind of cluster and move them so that we still protect the rural feel. So here's just some examples of, you just look at the site. You would do a lot yield. So on a standard subdivision, you would come up with that many houses on a standard subdivision. You would look at the conservation areas. In this particular example, there you have floodplain and wetlands, an archaeological site. Secondary would be the wooded areas that you can kind of see scattered around. Then what's left is the development areas in yellow. And then as it turns out, you can hide the houses. The best houses typically are the ones kind of tucked right at or just inside the woods, so that as you drive down the road, you're not looking at the houses. The people get to enjoy both the pasture in front and the woods behind them. Lay out your street network and to get there, and then that's your proposed lotting pattern. Same number of houses as in the lot yield, but you're preserving a lot of the areas that you're trying to preserve. So here's just a conceptual graphic. This is existing condition. Typical development, they would just develop everything, and that's as you drive down the road, that's what you would see is all the houses and businesses. It's hard to see, but this development has all the same number of houses and commercial development as that. It's just that they're tucked in to the edges and beside the tree. So as you drive down the street, you've got the rural feel with the same amount of development that you had before. Another example of rural design approach. This is just an example of some of the clustering. This is at 1 house per 2 acres in this example. If you take the same number of houses and put them at 1 per 1 acre, you cluster them and you leave all that open space available. Now, when you set aside that open space, you need to protect it, and so we would require conservation easements or agricultural easements to be placed on that, because what's going to happen is once you allow them to develop that, then they're going to come in, well, now I want to develop all that, and you really haven't accomplished anything. So there would be protections on that open space. In fact, you could even allow greater density and get more houses in and still try to protect the same amount of area. Another example about a typical conventional development, they would basically clear cut the site, mass grade it, put in streets, try to fix as many lots in there as possible. This approach, they actually have fewer lots, but they have less infrastructure because the streets are actually shorter. They don't have all the storm drainage that's involved. All this is underground storm drainage, whereas they're leaving a lot of that open, and they're keeping some of the undisturbed vegetated areas. And it turns out that the profit per lot is higher on this because you got lower costs, and it turns out that you can sell those lots at a premium because people like to live next to woods, particularly if they know that it's going to be protected. And you hear that all the time. People say, well, I bought my house because I wanted to be next to that big open field. Well, this is an example where they would have the assurance that that field would be there, and they'd be willing to, in fact, studies show that you can get as much as 20% more per lot that are adjacent to protected open space areas. Okay, tree preservation is one of the fun projects. I know that's going to be a hot issue as we move forward. This basically applies to undeveloped land and to some redevelopment. But the important thing is the exemptions. First, any existing property less than 1 acre with a single-family house. So you can do whatever you want with your trees if you've got 1 acre or less. Trees on existing platted subdivisions are exempt. Trees in the visibility triangle, trees in the corner that might be blocking your view, you can obviously take those down. Trees in the right-of-way, public utility easements, and drainage easements. We don't like trees in the drainage easements because they block the flow of the drainage, so we want to keep those out. And in trees that are diseased, dead, dying, or creating a public nuisance or damaging a foundation. So those are all exempt. Nobody's saying that you can't take any of those trees down. We're going to classify different trees and treat them slightly differently. We're going to create a class of trees called secondary trees. These include mesquite trees, bodark, locust, gum bromelia, hackberry, and cottonwood. Some people might call those trash trees. They're not as highly valued as other trees, so we're not going to have as high a protections on those trees as others. All the rest of the trees, including the pines and the oaks and pecans, protected trees will be those trees that are 18 inches in diameter at breast height. The standard location to measure a tree is at breast height, 4.5 feet off the ground. So if it's 18 inches or larger, those are called protected trees. If they're between 18 and 10 inches, they're called quality trees. And we're not going to regulate anything under 10 inches in diameter. And we can thank the legislature this summer for that standard. Most cities used to regulate 6 inches or more, but the legislature said, no, it's got to be 10 inches. We're also we're going to require that they inventory those trees because we need to know where they are, and they should want to know where they are so they can plan their development around those trees to try to protect those. But if there's a clump of trees, rather than individually identifying all those, you can put it into what's called a tree stand and just draw the outline of the stand, and we'll protect it that way. Also, we're treating the secondary trees. If they're over 18 inches, they're considered large secondary trees. If they're under that, then they're considered just plain secondary trees. There will be a requirement except for the exempt trees, that any tree over 10 inches in diameter would require a permit, just so we can kind of regulate what's being taken down. We'll require tree inventory as part of the development process. So when they do the survey plat, typically the surveyor will actually identify the trees and to identify the species and the diameter, so we can kind of monitor what's to be protected and what's coming out. And then they'll put together a preservation and mitigation plan. Preservation requirements depend on the subdivision size, and so you see down here the size of the subdivision, protected trees, quality trees, large secondary trees, and secondary trees. And you can see in all cases you can remove trees, but when you get a large subdivision with that we want to protect at least 70% of the protected trees. It goes down the smaller the lot because you have less flexibility, less work with.
So is that subdivision size? That's the lot size, right? Not the whole subdivision.
Well, it used to say lot size, but people would get confused because if you come in with a 20-acre subdivision and all the lots were half acre or less, they would say, well, that doesn't apply to me because they're half acre. So it's the subdivision size.
In my brain, I think like 2 acres inside the city that you subdivide into 2 1 acres.
We would look at that as a 2-acre subdivision.
Got it.
So you have the flexibility there. You might be able to move the lot line or move the building site within that 2 acres to avoid the trees. We know some trees are going to come down, so we also have some mitigation requirements that we want trees to be replaced if they're taken down. So this is the replacement rate. So for example, if you're over 2.5 acres, for the trees on an inch per inch basis, you would replace the protected trees at 1:1, secondary trees at 1/2 inch to 1 inch. And you can see down in some cases we don't require any mitigation at all, and fairly low mitigation for the small subdivisions. So that's the tree section. Questions? Comments?
I have a quick question. Does the subdivision or the proposed changes also address like development within the root zone of trees?
Well, we will have a section where we get into the street trees section, because street trees often next to the street. There is a requirement to, if you're going to save the, keep the tree, that you put construction fencing around the drip line or the root zone. Beyond that, there's not a lot of detail. I mean, we could, if that's something that of real interest to you.
Yeah, I was just curious, if we're going to, save some of these larger trees, then it would
Right.
probably be pertinent to also make sure nothing develops too close to them,
Right.
then cause disease and potential death in the future.
We also have to be careful, and I've seen some pictures of sites where they've graded down the site and then left the tree up on kind of a pad up above everything.
Right.
And that's not accomplishing anything either, so, but we'll need to watch that. So let's briefly talk about easements. Everybody realize easements are a property right dedicated to the city on private property for certain purposes. The most common is utility easements. So when the city runs a utility line across your property, that needs to be in a public easement for the city to have the right to be able to do that. We're typically going to require 10-foot utility easements on the front, side, and rear property where necessary for utilities. And I will note that this, haven't really vetted this with our electrical utility yet, because they want to have 20-foot easements. But I don't think that in a right-of-way that you need an additional 20-foot on private property to serve the electric utility. There's room enough, and they need the 20 feet to get the truck in safely to be able to work on the overhead lines. Well, if there's a street there, they ought to be able to handle that. So this is actually a benefit for the developers. A minimum 15-foot drainage easement will require that the 100-year floodplain be designated as an easement, and that's mainly just to put property owners and buyers on notice that, hey, there is floodplain there and there are limitations about what you can do. We're having what we're calling public open space easements, and that's the site visibility triangles. The current ordinance has standard 25 by 25 or 35 by 35 foot, right triangles at the corners. But that doesn't always help you on your site visibility, because there still might be something 25 feet down the street that still blocks your view. So we're proposing to go to a little bit more complex form, where we're actually looking at the site distances from the vehicle at the intersection. And so that little triangle there is what would be the public open space easement. And there's actually going to be 2 triangles at each intersection. So it doesn't take as much as the corner. It takes a little bit more as you go down the lot lines. But those are typically in the front yard anyway. It doesn't generally adversely affect anybody. There are some restrictions on what you can plant or build within that easement, because we don't want to have site visibility problems. We're going to talk about emergency access easements or fire lanes, how they're built. We need to make sure that they'll hold up. Fire trucks are not lightweight vehicles, so they need to be built to certain standards to hold up the fire lanes. And then a clear requirement of cross-access easements in commercial developments, to make sure that you can drive from one business to another business without getting off onto the main street and then coming back. A lot of businesses want to keep all their traffic right in there, but that forces congestion and conflict points out on the street. So we will require that driveways between businesses connect from on side to side. And we're doing that to some extent already, but we'll just make sure that's codified. Talked a little bit about street connectivity, just a quick exhibit to show, the problem with cul-de-sacs and isolated pods compared to a grid system, that you don't have to, if you're going from the school to your house, you don't have to go all the way around. And there's also lots of different ways to get from one point to another. So if one is blocked, you have alternate routes of access. We're requiring that developments connect to adjacent property to make sure that there's connectivity between one subdivision and another. I already mentioned the grid system and smaller block sizes and reduced cul-de-sacs. I put the question mark on street names because you don't have any provisions on restrictions on street names right now, other than to make sure they don't sound like another street in town. Some cities have some limitations on, can you name it after yourself, or can the person still be alive? There are some, and so we'll probably be talking about potentially some of those types of restrictions on street names. Make sure that streets on the comprehensive plan are built in the general location that they're shown, requiring 2 points of access for all subdivisions with more than 20 lots to make sure that we don't have only one way in and one way out, and that one way in is blocked for whatever reason. And after going through the fire, you all know the stories about what can happen when that occurs. And then also to minimize the number of driveways and arterial streets. An arterial street is designed to get as much traffic efficiently through, from one location to another. If you got lots of driveways onto there, you're slowing traffic down, you're increasing congestion, you're increasing the number of conflict points. And so we'll encourage shared drives to the extent possible on arterial streets. Now, when you get down to local streets, you like to have that access because you want to slow people down. Just a reminder, that's the thoroughfare plan, and also, all those streets are defined by different roadway types, and we'll have different standards for each of those roadway types. We have a long section on traffic impact analysis, and if you read your ordinance, you know that it goes 3 or 4 pages long. We are working to see if we can't simplify that. In fact, working with Wesley, we're trying to figure out, he would like to maybe go a different approach on TIAs anyway. So hopefully we can get that clarified. Clarify the threshold. Currently the threshold now is a daily maximum traffic. Traffic congestions don't occur all day long. They occur during peak hours. And so we'll probably be looking at a peak hour as a potential threshold. And then the possibility of doing those traffic impact analysis in-house. We would require the developer to provide us the data. Then he's got a big computer program and a consultant that's going to help him figure out what those impacts are. It'll save the developer money because right now the developers have to go hire a traffic consultant to do that study. And then we can put more of that onto getting the problems fixed as opposed to just studying them. I mentioned the street classification system, and we go from freeways, arterials, collectors, and residential local streets. This just basically shows the relationship of land access to mobility. So local streets, you want to have driveways. That's how you get to your house, is on a local street. So you want to have lots of access, but not a lot of traffic on that road. The other side of that is an arterial street. So you want to have a lot of traffic moving through there efficiently, but you don't want to have a lot of people accessing. So that's the flip. Collectors are the roads that are kind of in between. General spacing of arterials is usually 1 per mile. Collector streets are typically 1 every half mile or so. And of course, local streets have to be there to get to your house. We'll be working on street cross sections. As I said, we want to have the arterials designed to move traffic through, but we want to slow down traffic on collectors and locals, and we'll do that through the design, primarily narrowing lanes. People will drive as fast as they feel comfortable, no matter what speed limit you put on the road. And so, if you have a long straight path, a wide lane, well, a lane on a freeway is typically 12 to 14 feet wide, and the speed limit is 70 plus miles an hour. If you've got a 30-foot residential street with 2 lanes, you basically have a 15-foot lane, and if it's straight, people are going to want to drive fast. If you narrow that street down, then people will feel more constrained and they'll drive slower automatically. If you bring in trees or obstructions on either side, if you alter the pavement, so you have pavers or something like that, so the road surface changes. If you have parked cars on either side, people will automatically slow down, and so you won't have a speeding problem. And we'll accomplish that through the design of those streets. If you've read our current ordinance, you'll see that there's lots of repetition and lots of data and a lot of paragraphs. We're putting all those in tables to try to simplify things so you could simply look down a table and see what you need to design to. And then we're combining, there's street requirements, and then there's several different rural street requirements, and we're combining those to make those simpler as well. I mentioned the grid and shorter cul-de-sacs. We'll probably be revising the pavement design, and that may not be of big interest to you, but how thick the subgrade is versus how thick the pavement is, what the materials are. Our interest is to make sure developers build those to our standards, because once the subdivision is built, the city and the taxpayers get to maintain them. So if we allow them to get away with substandard pavement, we're going to be back out there fixing potholes in the future or fixing ruts, those kinds of things. Curb and gutter, we're going to go to a little bit different style of curb and gutter. I think our preference is going to be a ribbon curb and a grass line swale. Now, I didn't say bar ditch, I said a grass line swale. But trying to get away from the standard 6-inch, 7-inch curb and gutter on either side of the street, because what that does mainly is it just carries the water, and you got to take it somewhere and then handle it underground. If we can use more of flowing through grass at a slow rate, when we slow the water down and we help on water quality, those kinds of issues. Now, if we have an asphalt street, you can't just end asphalt and not expect it to kind of ravel and break off. So we will require them to build a concrete, what we call a ribbon curb at the same elevation, but there won't be anything to collect the water. The water will flow naturally off to the grassline swales.
I have a question.
Sure.
What width and depth on a grassline swale?
Well, that's one of the things that Wesley and I are working on. I have my own design, and one of the problems is engineers like curb and gutter because they've got a manual they can follow and says, well, I need to do this, this, and this. Designing a grassline swale takes a little bit more engineering thought. You often need wider right-of-way to make sure that the side slopes are not too steep, and you also need the longitudinal slope to not be too steep because you don't want the water to flow fast. And so it takes a little bit more design to do that.
Well, I'm curious because I have a grassline swale, which is steadily filling with every outrageous rainfall we have. And so it's becoming shallower and shallower. So how does one compensate for that?
If it's properly designed, it shouldn't do that. Now, it probably wasn't designed as a swale, it was probably designed as a bar ditch. And I've tried to make the distinction between the two.
No, it's actually through my yard. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, how do you ever compensate for loose soil eventually filling a swale?
Well, if it's truly grass line, there wouldn't be a lot of soil entering the stream to begin with. And then sometimes you have to have some longitudinal breaks, a concrete strip across to make sure that the slope stays the same as it goes downstream. Like I said, it takes a little bit more design than just a regular bar ditch. There'll also be standards for the rural pavement margins or shoulder, what we know as road shoulders. Yeah.
Do you have any kind of examples in your presentation of grassline swells that haven't failed?
Not in this one. Next month, or 1st of January, we'll be talking about drainage standards, and I'll make sure and include some of those. Here is just some street cross sections that actually come out of your thoroughfare plan. So these are ones that you all have already adopted. And you can see narrower streets with provision for sidewalks and bicyclists on either side. This is a arterial street with medians, and we'll address medians a little bit more clearly in the ordinance for the larger streets on up. There'll be information in there about intersections. We are putting in the possibility of roundabouts, though I know roundabouts are not always well received in some communities. I think that they worked well in low volume situations. a roundabout is designed so that a person drives up to the roundabout, always yields to the person in the roundabout. They're actually more efficient in terms of pass-through traffic because you're not always stopped at a stop sign waiting for somebody to pass. Where you have problems with roundabouts, or what they used to build were traffic circles, and we all know some traffic circles around. Now the difference technically is a traffic circle, the person entering the traffic circle didn't always have to yield. Sometimes the people on the circle had to yield when traffic came through. Roundabouts always have the right of way. But when you have large volumes of traffic, or when you have a lot of truck traffic, is when we tend to have problems. Trucks don't turn as tight a radius as cars do, and if they're trying to drive around a little circle in the middle of an intersection, they typically drive over them. So we will be very careful about where we would allow those to occur, but there are probably a lot of locations where it makes a lot of sense. And again, we'll talk about the site visibility triangles, cul-de-sacs, and this is just a sketch based on an actual development of how long and gangly cul-de-sacs can get. Some people now call those dead worms because if you look at an aerial photo from the air, they look kind of like dead worms laying on the ground. We're prohibiting private streets. We want to make sure that all the streets are open to the public and so that there's public access. A lot of developers want to do private streets because they want to cut corners on building the streets. And then what happens typically is 20 years down the road, they haven't collected enough money to maintain it. It needs to be major work done on it, and they want to give it back to the city. Well, we're just going to make sure, and it's a social equity issue too, to make sure that there are not some streets that are not open to the public, that all streets are open to the public. Alleys, mentioned for rear access, and here's
I had a question. Sorry. So, sorry, it was really loud. With that concept in mind, with things like gated communities, then we're trying to avoid those.
Right.
So, we would prohibit the development of like a gated community inside our city limits.
That's correct.
Okay.
There's some snout houses. So as you drive down the street, all you are seeing is the front garage door. They typically hide the front door way back here. It's often dark and kind of unsafe anyway, and doesn't really present the best picture of your home to the community. Driveways, limiting spacing on arterials and collectors, and then I talked about combining the city and rural standards. We'll have sections on traffic control and street signs and sidewalks and trails. We'll have some information on parking lots, and one of the things that we're grappling with is, do we allow some alternate paving types on parking lots? Does everything have to be paved? Maybe there can be some porous paving or some other types of paving that work just as well without tracking gravel and stuff out into the street or mud or those kinds of issues. So we'll probably come up with some standards for that. Fire lanes, as I mentioned, have some particular requirements, medians and street drainage standards. So examples of traffic calming, as I mentioned, you kind of narrow the street or you deflect the vehicle as you go down the street, or you end up changing the pavement type, the different ways to do it. And there's a concept now called context-sensitive design. In the old days, a street was a street, and we really designed it for the car. We didn't think about what was outside the edge of the pavement. Now more and more people are designing the street in its context, and so you'll have different standards for different kinds of neighborhoods. Lots and blocks. I mentioned the block perimeters and block lengths and public access at mid-block. On our lots, we want to make sure that they're all buildable, that they don't end up with a lot that just kind of got left over and you can't fit a house on it. We'll address flag lots. Flag lots, and this is an actual sketch plat that someone gave me. He wanted to develop his property with 20-foot lanes to all this property down to get to the main. Of course, the reason he did that is he didn't want to build a street. It would have made more sense to get the street through there. And it also makes it harder to develop this property in the future. If this person wanted to subdivide their property, they have no way of getting access to the public street. So we'll make clear standards about what, flag lots are not allowed. Basically, you do that by requiring a minimum width of the lot, make sure that the flag, if that's a flag, is at least that wide. Corner lots need to be a little bit bigger, and one for the site visibility standards, and just fitting the house on a corner is often difficult without having additional space. We'll look at lot drainage standards. The vast majority of localized flooding is not from the street or a creek, it's from one person's lot onto another person's lot. So we want to make sure that all the lots are graded to go to a street or go to a dedicated drainage easement.
I'm sorry, another question. Since we're going to the alley concept, does that mean that trash pickup and rubbish will also be picked up in the alley?
That will be a decision to be made later, but that makes more sense than putting the big trash bins out on the public street.
So how much wider do you need to make the alley then?
Well, the alley really only needs to be about 16 to 20 foot wide, and that's wide enough for a garbage truck to come in. But we'll double check that to make sure that they can.
And brush, because this town has lots and lots of brush pickup.
Well, there might have to be alternate, you might have to be able to put the brush out front, so. Because you don't want people blocking the alley. The alley's not wide to begin with. Some cities are requiring additional stream bank buffers. We will typically require that bank to bank be in an easement, but up above the bank, that you do want to protect a certain amount of that. And a big part of that is just simply for erosion. I know where I was before, there were a lot of people that bought their house right up next to the stream bank, and suddenly the stream bank started eroding, and they came to City Hall and say, fix my problem. Well, we didn't make you buy your house on that stream bank. It would have been a lot better if we had required them to build the house a little bit further off so that the bank would kind of stabilize before it got to their house. Orientation to public parks. One of the problems is often developers will want to back houses up to the park, and you can't see the park. So it becomes hidden, and it becomes kind of a no man's land. Parks work a lot better when there is visibility from a street. So we will be requiring that there'll be open area so that you can see from the street into the park, as opposed to the park being somewhere back behind those houses, and then people don't feel safe going back there.
Does that encourage development that has a park at the center versus on one side or the other?
Having a square or a commons area works that way. Developers don't like it because it's only a one.
It's a waste
side,
of property.
They like to have they like to have two sets of houses to pay for that street. And in this case, it's only one set of houses. So they're getting less revenue to pay for that expense. But that's just part of doing business. And for those who are really into surveying, we'll have standards for setting monument corners for subdivisions and lot pins at each of the corners to make sure that someone pulls out the plat, they can actually find it on the ground when they go out there. And so that's part 2. And again, I apologize that I don't have text for you yet, but I will get that as soon as possible. And then within the next month, we will be talking about part 3, which will be the end. So questions, comments? Are we going the right way, wrong way?
I was going to say my favorite part of this rewrite is the pulling of large amounts of data and putting them into table formats. Mm-hmm. It's visually easier to use and much less complicated to understand for somebody who's maybe subdividing a few lots, but not a developer that's doing 100 lots.
And Wesley probably talked about it last month, but part of what we're doing is we're reordering the ordinance so there's a logical flow as you go through it. The current ordinance, you have to kind of jump around to figure out what applies to your particular project.
Wes, did we talk last month about, the last few months we've talked about it, the difference in processes between like a developer versus somebody that's like, hey, I have an acre that I want to split in half, and did we?
Yeah, I mean,
and simplifying that for the smaller guys.
It's not really based on who you are, but the type of project that you're doing.
Right.
And so if you have one or a couple of acres and you're just a mom and pop trying to divide it up, it's a relatively easy process to go through. There's 4 different processes. One of the things that we're allowed to do as a city is we get to decide which process each individual person gets to go through. And we're trying to simplify it. We're trying to cut the length of time it takes to get through the system. We're not anti-development. We just want to make sure it's quality development.
I want to thank you so much. I'm very encouraged by that. I think we're going to stay very unique with this approach. We're not going to lose our identity, which is what I think we've all wanted. I'm really excited about what I'm hearing. I'm excited about the green nature of it too, and the drainage. And thank you.
Okay.
Kind of to Patrick's point, just that, redevelopment of existing land within the city also falls under this idea of development.
Right.
And just that, not even just subdividing property, but homeowners that are redoing property to prevent urban decay, that, obviously they find an easier path to go through than the 100-acre subdivision that a developer might be doing.
And redevelopment is always harder because you have a lot more constraints on you than if you're out in a green field with no constraints. And so we're trying to build in some flexibility to make sure that gets done too.
Maybe think so. So we're talking about just the subdivision. So taking something and changing it from what it currently is, correct? So, and mainly my question is related to, we have a ton of property north of the tracks that is odd shaped, small, and difficult to develop under our current ordinance, which is something I've kind of had an issue with for a while. We're not talking about that here, right? This is just changing what we currently have into something different, and that's what needs to apply, right?
Yeah, subdivision by nature, or by definition, is dividing a piece of property into two or more pieces. So if you're just redeveloping an existing lot, this doesn't apply. The zoning is what would apply to that. Now, a lot of the places, they end up wanting to either split lots or combine lots because what they have now is unbuildable. So, so this would address that. But
okay, just clarifying for me.
And I think just to kind of, we're working on the subdivision right now. There's obviously a need to look at some of the other ordinances. I think the plan is that as we go forward, we will begin relooking at zoning and some other ordinances that will help your development be more of what you want as opposed to getting what you get just from the project. Now, I don't know if when I introduce myself, I insist that I'm the interim. And interim means that I have an expire date. But I think the mayor and city manager have been talking about maybe having me come and help with some of the other ordinance updates. And so it's not going to end when I leave. So this is just one of the ones I can do before I leave.
You got it started, so you're going to have to see it through.
Well,
We like you. We won't let you go until you see it through.
well, that's my fear, is they won't let me go. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation, Commissioners. Thank you for your questions. We'll close the workshop and go back into our regular business. Item 4A, consider action to elect a commission member as chair for the Planning and Zoning Commission and to elect other officers as may be necessary. Sadly, long-serving commission member and long-serving chair Lisa Patterson felt it was in her best interest to, for a number of reasons, to submit her resignation. I know this board and this body will miss her and miss her expertise, and sometimes you have an expiration date, and I know we all wish Lisa well, and she's not leaving town or anything, so we'll be able to call on her from time to time. So at this point, we would take nominations for chair.
I would like to nominate Patrick, if you want to be chair.
I was actually going to suggest moving just the chain of command up, and I was actually going to suggest recommend that Debbie Moore be moved to the chair. So if that's a motion I can make, I'll make a motion to move Debbie Moore into the chair's position.
I second them.
It would probably be more appropriate for you to do nominations and you can vote.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Never mind.
You can nominate Debbie.
I'm gonna do that.
Diana can nominate you.
Is there a second? We don't necessarily have to have seconds.
We're just nominating right now, so right? Yeah, so everyone can nominate.
We don't necessarily have to have seconds, but it's been tradition. Okay.
It's you and I, it sounds like.
Okay. Are there any other nominations for chair? And if not, is there a motion to close nominations?
Make a motion to close, please.
Motion to close. Do we need a second on that? We need a second to close nominations. Second by Ms. Rose. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed?
Do we just take a vote then? Is that how that works?
There's no other nominations, so it'd be election by acclamation. I bet.
Well, you've got two candidates right now, so the appropriate, unfortunately, we can't do secret ballots because the open meetings law requires that everything be done with voting. So Viviana will call each of you and you will signify which candidate you are going to vote for. I realize that's what some of you have speech.
I made no speech. 0 speeches.
Yeah,
So-
on a campaign, that's like.
Yeah.
0 speeches.
So, all right, Diddy, call the roll, please.
All right. Debbie Moore. Patrick Connell.
Debbie.
Alyssa Halley Schramm.
Debbie.
Diana Rose.
Debbie.
Cynthia Meyer.
Debbie Moore.
Sue Ann Fruget.
Debbie Moore.
Matt Lassen.
I can vote for Patrick.
Thank
Gotta get one.
Thank you for your confidence. There'll be some big shoes to fill, and I'll do my best.
We're gonna have to do this again.
So now we need to have a Now we need to have a nomination for vice chair.
I nominate Patrick for vice chair.
Patrick for vice chair. Any other nominations? Seeing none, is there a motion to close nominations?
A motion to close.
Is there a second?
Second it.
Nominations are closed. No other candidates. Patrick, you are elected by acclamation. Now we need
One more.
one more. We need to have a secretary. So are there nominations for
And an
secretary?
HLC member as well.
I'm sorry?
Okay. All right. But we're still going to do that one, right? Okay.
He was the only one nominated, so. Now we need nominations for secretary. The floor is open. Don't everybody rush now. It's not a hard job.
I'll nominate Diana.
Nominate Diana Rose. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none, is there a motion to close nominations?
Motion to close.
Is there a second by Patrick?
Second, yeah.
Congratulations, Ms. Rose, you're now our secretary. So we will move forward as best we can with reliance on our interim director and all the qualified staff that we have. We appreciate it. The one other thing that we need to do is we need to elect someone to represent us on the Historic Landmark Commission. Give us a little rundown on how often they meet, what that entails, and the like, just so everyone knows.
So the Historic Landmark Commission meets once a month on the, third Wednesday. Right? Okay, good. Once a month. What they review is properties that want to get onto the Historic Landmark registry for the city. And then they also review, at this point, it's a certificate of appropriateness for properties that are already on that registry on what kind of, if the changes that they're making to their house are appropriate. Right now, actually, we're in process of reviewing the current code, and we plan to, I think by February, come up with a draft new historic landmark ordinance that has a little bit more substance and that will meet the state requirements to get certified local government status. So that's one of the things they're working on right now, is reviewing that, and then we'll be reviewing some draft code over the next several months to look at the different categories and standards, with the idea of once we can get that certified local government status with the state, that then we can apply for grants for other parts of the historic preservation efforts, like a design guidelines and historic surveys, those kind of things. So, and yeah, it can be, the representative can be anyone from P&Z, so hopefully it's someone who is interested in this and has some maybe background on historic preservation. And if you find that it's not your cup of tea after several months, we can always come back and nominate someone else.
If there is someone on the commission who might be interested but don't want to nominate themselves, if you could just kind of let them
Well, I'm
know.
interested, and I will nominate myself.
You will nominate yourself? Okay. No shame with this man. Matt nominates himself. Is there anyone else interested in serving in this capacity? Diana? Diana Rose is interested also. Any other people who are interested?
Did she nominate herself as well?
Yes.
Okay.
She volunteered, yes. Matt nominated himself, but Diana volunteered.
Well, as Diana is interested as well, I will happily withdraw my name.
So you're withdrawing your... All right. Is there a motion to close nominations?
Motion to close.
Second.
Motion and second. So nominations are closed. Congratulations, Ms. Rose. Appreciate your volunteering. Hopefully that's all the elections we have for tonight, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now we need to move on to approving the minutes from our last meeting. Have you all had a chance to read them? Any amendments, corrections, additions, deletions?
Motion to approve as is.
Motion to approve is. Is there a second? Second by Ms. Meyer. Vivi, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, ma'am. Debbie Moore,
Yes.
Patrick Connell,
Yes.
Alyssa Halley Schramm,
Yes.
Diana Rose,
Yes.
Cynthia Meyer,
Yes.
Sue Ann Fruget,
Yes.
Matt Lassen.
Yes.
Thank you. Minutes are approved. Item 4D, public hearing and consider action to approve the first reading of an ordinance to rezone lots 1 and 2.
No, so.
Yeah, that has been withdrawn.
Yes, that's been
And have we
withdrawn.
understand we've gotten information that it's,
Their letter said that it was permanently withdrawn,
permanently
not
withdrawn.
pushed to another meeting.
so this is the last time we'll see it?
Unless they reapply, yes.
Okay, at the moment anyway. Item 4E, public hearing and consider action to approve the first reading of an amendment to the Bastrop Code of Ordinances, Chapter 14, zoning, Section 37, exterior construction requirements. Ms. Beal.
Yes, this is a super exciting topic. It might be if you're into construction materials. So just kind of a brief background on what we're talking about. In our zoning ordinance, we have a section that has the requirements for our site development plans. So any, even a house, everything is required to show what they're being made out of. So we have a list of acceptable materials that can be used on the exterior of structures in the city of Bastrop. For what we're talking about tonight, we're specifically talking about commercial, office, industrial park, and multifamily zoning, and then also a little bit talking about our light industrial zoning districts. Each one of these have, the code breaks it down into 3 sections: residential, commercial, office, industrial, multifamily, and then light industrial. So there's 3 separate sections regarding how you can build the outside of your building. In this instance, for commercially zoned properties mostly, the allowable materials are masonry, which includes stone, brick, concrete masonry units, concrete panels, and plaster finishes, then wood, glass, hardy plank, or other concrete composites, and metal only as an architectural feature on the property, so it has to go over the masonry that's there.
What's the idea behind that?
What now?
What's the idea behind that?
I think fire rating, to make sure that you still have the appropriate fire rating on the wall. And to give you some examples of what we're talking about, stone, you'll see commonly on buildings, brick material, concrete masonry units, which sometimes can be cinder blocks, but they're an actual kind of a brick made out of concrete versus a brick that's made out of clay. It's a different process. This building is actually one that's over there by Walmart that's got the concrete masonry units with a thin layer of coating over it. Concrete panel, which is also referred to as tilt wall construction, and plaster finishes, also referred to as stucco. You'll see it on the Bastrop County Courthouse. It can have a number of different looks, from a pebbled finish to a troweled-on look. Glass, curtain walls, glass block. You can have wood siding. And then hardy plank, which is a cement fiber. So this is actually rated as a masonry material for fire rating. It looks like wood commonly, but it's actually a cement fiberboard material. And then this is composite materials. One of the common ones is exterior insulation and finishing systems, which is EFIS, which is basically a series of layers, and the last layer is a reinforcing mesh with a concrete composite finish. And this is something that's currently allowed in our code. Within Section 37, there's a requirement for commercial buildings that the street-facing or residential-facing facades must be 100% masonry. And then the other exterior facades have to be at least 50% masonry. And that does exclude the area for windows and doors. By comparison, the light industrial district is very similar. The only difference is on the, if a building is over 7,000 square feet on the first floor, the sides of the building can be metal as long as they're not facing a street or residential area. So you'll see this example down in our industrial park. The front of the building is actually stone and a plaster EFIS finish on the front, and then it's got the painted metal side. Metal building construction typically is what you'll see in older examples around town, the ribbed metal with paint finish on it. In our single family and two family districts, we allow a subset of these, mostly stone, wood, brick, plaster finish, glass, hardy plank. However, we do not allow metal, concrete, or masonry units as the sole building material in residential. So what we are proposing tonight is to amend this section specifically in the allowances for the non-residential, excluding light industrial, so the commercial office, those districts, and the light industrial, to add a section that allows the planning director to review alternate building material proposals by an applicant to see how they, if they can meet our standard, the intent of the code for exterior building materials. So in that, the building material has to be of equal or better quality than was what currently required by code. It can't adversely affect the physical character of the area that the building is located, and it has to meet the intent of the code to provide that masonry look and feel to the development. And if the applicant disagrees with the decision of the planning director, they always have the ability to appeal to the Planning and Zoning Commission for reconsideration. What has prompted this amendment is the Covert Chevrolet dealership is in the process of getting their site plan finalized, and this is their current building in the middle of their site, and they're planning to expand the building on both sides in the rear, and they would like to use a metal composite material, and I have an example here that I'll show you in a second, that is actually far more energy efficient and has the same look of a lot of our plaster and EFIS finishes that are currently allowed by code. You can see this area is currently zone C2, surrounded by C1, and then this is the future. It's actually under construction, Hunter's Crossing Apartments and the gas station right there. So it's in the middle of a fairly commercial area currently. And it'll be their office with their service bays in the back, so you'll have a lot of garage bays on both sides. And we have some show and tell of what this material, the specific material they are proposing. So in each case, an applicant would have to give us the specifications and give us an example of what material they're proposing for the planning director to make a decision and approval for the material. When the applicant is here, then they can probably answer more very specific questions.
And as you look at the sample, the requirement for masonry construction includes stucco, but stucco is defined as being either 5/8 or 3/4 inch thick. Well, that has essentially a stucco cover, but it doesn't meet that requirement. So I had to reject this because it didn't meet your current ordinance. But think about, what is the intent of having masonry construction? It's for the look and it's for the durability, sustainability. Well, as new products come out, you can't always have your ordinance up to date to make sure that, so this is just a little bit of flexibility to allow consideration of newer materials as they come forward.
As a guess, how many other alternate materials might there be out there that are not already accepted by the ordinance?
Well, there are new materials coming out all the time.
Right, I'm saying like the common.
I don't know that this is going to be a common, or it's going to be a situation where people are going to try to sneak stuff through that is not going to meet the director's approval. So
my thought is that if, in your opinion, this fits the spirit of what the ordinance is after.
Yeah, I think it fits the intent,
so,
if not the letter.
My thought would be, you can give your opinion. What's the difference between us changing the ordinance to allow the planning director some latitude and not just adding this as a acceptable material?
Well, what we're proposing is not specific to this material.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't seem like this would come up as a very often thing that would happen very often, where we have a new material that somebody wants to throw out there.
Yeah, well, I think you may be faced then with every year or two having to go back and add the new space age material that we didn't know about.
I'm just wondering whether it makes more sense to give latitude to the planning director for new materials and shoulder them with the burden of approval or disapproval, or just going through and adding it to the list if it makes sense overall. Does that make sense?
I understand, but I think what I'm saying is I think this proposed is a little bit more flexible than having to go through each time somebody comes in with a new material. This approach allows the staff to consider whether the material meets the requirement. And we're really basically just talking about the masonry portion of it, as opposed to having to come back to the commission every time to consider, well, do you like this, or does this meet the requirements or not? I mean, it's entirely up to you all as far as what your recommendation to council might be. But
I have a question. Could you go back a slide to show the language? And then what is required to prove that a material is equal or of better quality?
They've actually provided a study that gives detailed specifications for the material, that gives the fire rating, the insulation ability, and then how the exterior finish is applied, so that it's not something that's going to flake off on the first hailstorm. So that used to be kind of the concern with these products 10, 15 years ago, was how durable that finish was going to be on the metal, or whether or not it was just going to shear off when something hit it. So they provided all the specifications that give that detail. So.
Okay, so as written, I like that it provides flexibility, because materials are changing so rapidly nowadays. Would that be required of all new materials that come in? I guess, would it be planning director discretion of what is required to meet that, equal or better?
it would be all materials that don't otherwise meet your current ordinance.
Okay.
Yes.
And they'd have to prove it.
Right. And I would argue that that is more durable than EFIS, which is allowed. So, it doesn't take a whole lot to put a hole in an EVIS wall. You know, you throw a baseball at it, you're going to end up with a big divot. So that looks pretty sustainable to me.
And I'm sure that the director would have to have studies, and if it's just out today, we wouldn't necessarily approve it because we don't have any history or statistics on durability in other places. And how would we handle something like that?
Well, and you might want to ask the architect that as well, but you know, as they develop material in order to sell it, they've got to go through some environmental testing and
Some warranty periods, I would imagine, huh?
Right.
Okay.
So after P&Z makes a recommendation tonight, this will go to City Council on the December 12th meeting and to then the January 9th meeting if they approve this material. And just to kind of reiterate, yeah, this would change the code for all future people who would make this request, not just for Covert Chevrolet. So.
Well, what is the, here's what I envision, worst case scenario, we get a planning director at some point who they know what they like, and they're not very broad in interpreting this, and there's been issues in the past where we've had, you know, wow, this is what I see as the vision for where we should go. So this stuff, no, but this stuff, yes, and it's not really what I would consider a fair process or to everybody, a fair process to everybody that's going through it. What do you think?
Well, that's why we put that last provision in there about appeals.
Okay.
So if you had a planning director that just arbitrarily didn't like stuff, the applicant would always bring it to you guys to decide whether now, you have to think about the reverse of that is what if the planning director approves lots of stuff that you decide you don't like? And I think your approach with that is to talk about maybe counseling the planning director or having them look for another job.
That was my original question that I had was that would be my concern as well, that we have lots of stuff going out there where, you know, the planning director shoulders that whole burden of approving or disapproving something where, you know, adding it to the agenda and spending 20 minutes talking about it, I don't think is a huge deal.
Yeah, it could be another staff member. I mean, you could assign it to the city engineer or the city manager, but somebody's got to do it. And I figured the planning director was the appropriate person, whoever he or she may be.
I want to say that review process can also just sit right here, you know, as representatives of the people versus the staff who are kind of there to apply the people's will through us. And so I'm kind of with Patrick. I like that they give staff flexibility, but I can see where a disinterested staff member might be one way or an overinterested staff member might take it another way, whereas bringing it to the people that are kind of here to represent the people and just making a decision as citizens that live in this community. If the research is there that it's as durable, it meets the intent of the code, it just happens to be a new product, it seems like a fairly easy process to pass something.
So you're saying if the planning director wants to approve a new material that's outside what the code is, they would just bring it here and provide us with their rationale for the approval?
Absolutely, and then it also prevents them from shouldering, as Patrick said, the entire burden for something most of the cities could potentially say they don't like.
And also, as a possibility for the applicant to hear the applicant's side.
Yeah, and that
It would it not be a forum for that also?
it would be the other point of this is it's pushed back their schedule a month or two on having to come and get the approval for the additional material. So that's another consideration is if every time we have a new material come up, the applicant has to come before P&Z, that'll take another month or two in their site plan approval process that they might not otherwise have to go through.
That's definitely a consideration.
But somebody, like you said, once a material like this is approved, it's on a list of approved materials. So the next person that wants to build with this won't have the same burden of proof. But at some point, the pathway has to be paved.
I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I mean, if this was approved, while it would make sense that it would be approved for somebody else, they still have to go through the process to get it approved It wouldn't just be automatically added to the list of approved materials in the ordinance.
Yeah, but during our approval process, we can add it to make the amendment.
Right, so I would say tonight, something I would want to propose at some point whenever we get to that point in the meeting is just to add this material to our list. If the staff thinks it's a solid material or better than what we already have that's up there, that it makes no sense not to just add this material to our list of approved materials.
Either way, we have to amend the ordinance. So
Yes.
Your recommendation to the city council can be either to, as proposed, or you could amend this to say, we would prefer that in that first line that the Planning and Zoning Commission may authorize. I mean, that's obviously something that you all can recommend as well. So it's entirely up to you all.
Joanne, did you have anything else? Your light's still on. Okay. You say that the main drawback in not just giving the planning director the authority is the delay. Or it could be a month. But do I have a motion? Wait, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Thank you very much. I'm still learning. So now we'll open the public hearing. Is there anyone here that would like to speak on this? Okay. If you like, just identify yourself, please, sir.
My name is Bill Perkins. I'm the architect working with the Colbert family on their project over there. And we've come up with this material as a relatively new product, particularly for the city. I know that there's similar materials that have been used in the city, but not the insulated panel. So we're trying that because it's such a volume of space over there. Currently, they have an open air 22-door facility. What we're doing is we're completely closing it, conditioning, and having 3 doors. So what do we do to close the building in? A huge, long building is one thing. It's also over 100 yards from the street. So driving down the road, we had some photographs. You can't even see it's in your car. So we thought we'd have at least a sustainable material that would last quite a while. One of the other things is, as far as recommending this, I, as an architect, am not going to come to you as a pioneer saying we want to approve this material, because we have a 25-year liability on projects we do. I don't want to come here 20 years from now going, it really failed, we didn't really know what we're doing. So that's one thing. We do a lot of research on our product before we make presentations also.
Is that standard, the 25-year?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So with planning director, if we have an architect that requests a new material, planning director says, yeah, we think we ought to allow them to do that. The architect has to stand behind it for 25 years. That it is durable and will last, right?
Pretty much.
So, thank you. If you would, just give Viviana your name and so we can have it for the minutes, please, sir. Yes, okay. Okay. So if I was not aware of that, if that's the case, I think it puts a new wrinkle on everything.
I think that, I mean, from what I see, the argument isn't necessarily the material.
Are we public hearing?
Yeah, close the public hearing, and thank you. If no one else wishes to speak. Okay, Matt, go ahead.
I'm going to say, I mean, like you said, we trust staff at this moment, and we've got a very good recommendation from the architect about the material and the staff, and obviously the architect stands behind it. I don't think it's necessarily this particular material that's in question at this moment. It's more the process of how to approve future materials that I feel uncomfortable with. And I think bringing material to us and having us look at it is fine with me. And I understand this delayed their project a little bit, but it's already delayed, and the next person that wants to use this won't have to go through the same process, as this will be added to a list of approved facade materials. And so, yeah.
Is there any other comments, or do you want to make a motion?
I would suggest, not hearing that you're probably going to recommend that you would rather have the Planning and Zoning Commission make a determination. I would also, as a subsidiary motion, say that you approve that material, so.
Absolutely.
Come back again
Absolutely.
Already.
a couple
Yeah.
months down the road, so.
Right.
So I have a motion to approve this amending language with the stipulation that we replace planning director with planning and zoning commission, and then a separate amendment that adds this material that's been presented and recommended by staff. We just add that to the approved masonry list for, what is it, non-residential excluding light industrial specifically. Is that
And light residential, so, or light, sorry, not light residential.
Whatever that
was
is.
wrong. Light industrial
That.
was what that word was supposed to be, sorry.
Yeah.
Section
That.
3, yeah.
Viviana, you have that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And I will second that motion.
Motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Viviana, would you call the roll?
Yes, ma'am. Debbie Moore,
Yeah.
Patrick Connell,
yes?
Alyssa Hallie Schramm,
Yes.
Diana Rose,
No.
Cynthia Meyer,
Yes.
Sue Ann Fruget,
Yes.
Matt Lassen.
Yes.
Motion passes. Thank you very much.
And just so nobody's surprised, we will bring both to the council with your recommendation to choose.
Right.
What they do is,
Yes, we know. Number 5A, Director of Planning and Zoning Commission on any items to be included on future agendas. Anybody have anything they would specifically like to see discussed at future meetings?
I did want to ask a question. I feel like it's been like 3 or 4 months since I saw my last monthly update that came through. Are we still doing those?
Oh, no, we're not doing that hand-created monthly report that we used to do. Because we have a new system now that we can print reports, but that was just one that we would kind of hand jam in and then send out.
Is there a way to start that through that system? Like get a printout or PDF or something goes out like we were
Lon is
similar?
working on a project log in regards to ongoing projects for site development and different things like that. So once that gets up and running, we could see, but I think Mr. Gaddis has something.
I enjoyed it because it just gives you a good feel for what all is going on without.
what I'd suggest is the city manager puts out a weekly operational report for all of the departments in the city. And what we can do is we can extract the planning, and I assume, Wesley, you wouldn't mind the engineering development segments, compile those into a report that we can give you as part of your packet.
That'd be awesome.
Okay.
Is there any other business? Number 6,
Motion to adjourn.
motion to adjourn.
Second?
If anybody wants to stay, stay. Thank you very much.
And you don't need a motion to adjourn. If you're at the end of the agenda, you as chair can adjourn the
Oh,
meeting.
thank you.